I'm going to start us out with some prayer, and then we will jump in. But before I do, I want to say I'm glad everybody's here. If you're watching online or if you're actually physically here, I know there's been multiple said they're going to be watching it online today. So I thank you. I'm really excited to dive into, of course, you can see the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be looking at that. We're going to start with an introduction, as you can see on your papers there. We're going to be looking at the introduction of the Gospel of Mark. And then next week, we will begin going verse by verse. And again, I can't tell you how long we might be on one verse compared to another verse, but we will go as much as it allows us to go, because I think that some verses we could probably sit on for a while, and some verses we might take just a few seconds, just a few minutes. So, regardless, we're going to try to pull as much out of the text as we can and also use it. That's the one thing that I really want to stress, is that I want us to be able to apply these truths as well. So it's not just going to be a class of us going through the verse by verse just to get some knowledge. It's also going to be us looking at the verses, then going, okay, how can I apply that in my own life as well? So we're going to have a little spin on it to where it's not just theological, it's also practical, and I think that's what we're supposed to be doing as when we're teaching this, is we're actually making it to where we can build more disciples for Christ. So let me pray, and we will jump right in because we do have a lot to talk about. So, God, thank you for this class. Thank you for all the previous classes we've had and the knowledge you've already instilled in us. But, God, as we begin a new journey in the book of Mark, Lord, I pray that you would be over this entire series. You would give us fresh insights. You would give us wisdom that only comes from you. And I pray that as we look at this book of Mark, one of the main themes that we see that you've given us, Lord, is that you are trying to communicate who your Son is, who Jesus Christ truly is. And that's what we see in the book of Mark, is that your Son, your infallible, perfect, true Son, came to this earth for us, for me, to die on a cross, to be resurrected, to give us new life so that we can be with you forever, in a relationship with you forever, Lord. So the Gospel of Mark is not just a historical account, which it is. It's also a book that reveals the great truth that you are a God who loves us, and you are a God who came down for us, and let us never forget that. So, God, again, thank you for this time. Give us that wisdom again, and let us just have a fun time enjoying your word. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right, so let us begin. Introduction to the Gospel of Mark. I'll never forget, I took this class a couple of years ago. Maybe it was a year or two ago. I don't remember. And it was on the Gospel of Mark. And I loved it so much because I had a teacher. His name was Dr. Elledge. And he's one of my favorite professors I've ever had. So humble, so just meek, And he taught the whole class. And now I know some Greek, okay? But I don't know fluent Greek. Like, I'm not fluent in Greek, okay? That's one day down the line, hopefully. But he literally taught the whole class with his paper notes and his Greek Bible, and he just read straight from the Greek Bible, and that is where a lot of these notes come from. So what's amazing about it is the things that we're going to be looking at in the grammar and the syntax and the context and all these different things is that I'm getting notes from someone reading straight from the Greek Bible, and there's things that we can pick up on, that we will pick up on, that the average eye looking at an English Bible won't see. So that's the really cool part about this class, is that I get to relay that information to you. So when we get to it, I'll show you. So for example, I'll just give you one quick example. There's a passage where the woman that has the blood disease comes to Jesus, and there's this part where she's tired and exhausted and all these different things. And in the Greek, you can literally look in the Greek and you can see how it is exhausting to read all these different lines of how exhausted she is and all this kind of stuff. And it actually is something they use to show that she was exhausted from all of her days of this blood disease. Anyway, we'll get to all that. But there's a lot of fun stuff for us to get to today, like this. Something that we need to know when we dive into any book of the Bible is the historical context for which we find ourselves. So, for example, in the book of Mark, it is important for us to look at some components of first century Jerusalem, first century Israel, right? And what's going on, or Rome itself. As a whole. So, when we look at the components of the first century, the first thing that we need to know is that it is under Roman occupation. Now, you might be going, Colby, duh, it was under Roman occupation. Well, how do we know? Well, Jesus died by crucifixion. I mean, that was a Roman form of punishment, probably one of the cruelest of all times. And our Savior underwent it, right, by Roman occupation. But it wasn't just the punishments, it was the entire way of living. They were under Roman rule, right? Stemmed back from Alexander the Great and different conquests. So we see that during Jesus's day, when we pick up on the Gospel of Mark, is that they're under that Roman occupation. We also see, if we're thinking about that Roman occupation, is that there's some things that we're going to pick up on as we go through the book of Mark that distinguishes this. For examples, like tax collecting, like the business trade, like the context of their everyday life, whereas the Jews were under that Roman occupation, but they still had to give what was to Caesar. We'll see that too, right? So there's a lot of things in the context of this first century day that's going to help us understand better what the Bible is trying to teach us. And if you don't know these things, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So that's the first thing we see. The second thing we see is this. There's Greek culture involved. Not only is it just the Roman occupation, but it's also the Greek culture as it relates to what that brought with it. For example, we're going to see in different places where there is syncretism. We talked about this before in other classes, but it's the idea of like plurality of religions or plurality of gods. For example, how about like the Zeus gods and all these different, I can't even say that, plurality of gods that we see. And even in certain instances, we're going to see they try to combine these gods together in the day of Jesus, in the day after as well, like we see with Paul in Acts 17. So that's something that we're going to need to look at, and we're going to need to think about is how did the Greek culture impact the writings of the Gospels, including the Gospel of Mark. The next thing that we're going to see is Judaism. So how does Jewish culture, how does the Jewish religion fit into this first century, right? How does living out this lifestyle fit into the Gospel of Mark? And we're going to see that as well as we go through. So that's something to note, is that we're living in a time, again, where the Roman occupies, but the Jews are still trying to live out their faith. As a matter of fact, something that's very important in the book of Mark that we'll get to as well is the destruction of the temple. So we have to understand that these events are foretelling the destruction of the temple, the temple services, and why that matters. Because guess what? If you know anything about Old Testament, like we just read with all the prophets, we know that the temple matters, doesn't it, to the Jews? We know that the religious systems matter to the Jews because that was the way that God set it up back in the Old Testament. So it's, again, important for us to recognize that component too. And again, we could talk way more about all three of those things, but I just wanted to give you, those are some things we need to keep in our mind. Okay, Roman occupation, Greek culture, Jewish systems, right? And another thing that we need to think about is this. This is a very important thing in line with the Jewish religion. The expectation of the Messiah. And I have a question mark there because who can tell me what the main expectation of the Messiah would have been during this time?
That he was going to be a king. He was going to set the captives free from Roman occupation.
Good, right? So if we're thinking about the Roman occupation, if we're thinking about their culture, they're thinking, okay, Rome is the new Babylon. And it's interesting because Mark actually uses the word Babylon for Rome. We'll get to that as well. But Rome is the new Babylon. They have taken over the Jews, and they're enslaved by them. They're occupied by them. And this Messiah that's coming, and when he comes onto the scene, He is that Davidic king. We go back to 2 Samuel 7. We don't have to go there right now, but if you know that covenant with David that God made with him, that there will always be a ruler on his throne. And it'll be one day a great ruler, a perfect ruler, a righteous ruler who's going to come and set all things right. And it wasn't Solomon. It wasn't David's son. It was a future son that would come through the lineage of David, which we're going to see in the book of Mark, that it is Jesus Christ. Another place we see is Ezekiel 34, where we look at the shepherd king, the great priestly king, the servant Davidic king that would come as well. And then in Psalm 89, we get another example of this Davidic king that's coming. But the thing about it is that like Mr. Dennis just said, this Davidic king that was coming to restore the land and restore the peace that Jews had when they were in the will of God. He was coming to make all things right, free them from oppression. However, what we see is that this Davidic king that comes, what we're going to see in Mark, was not to free them from physical oppression, but to free them from what? Spiritual oppression. And then next, what we're going to see that makes Mark's gospel a little bit different is there's an emphasis on the suffering Messiah, which we're going to get to again in a second as well. We're going to look at the themes there. The suffering Messiah, like in Isaiah, that's really where we can tie it back to Isaiah. There's a lot of Isaiah themes in the book of Mark because we're going to look at this Messiah who isn't going to come as this kingly with his robe and take over and all this power and all this kind of stuff in that way. No, like in Philippians 2, it says he's going to come to us as a humble one. Matter of fact, he's going to come to us as humble as you can come as a baby. And he's going to come and grow up and become this true king that was prophesied even back in the days of Isaiah, this true suffering Messiah. He would suffer for the sins of his people. And we're going to see that play out. Through his crucifixion, of course, and through his life. So again, they're not really thinking about that type of Messiah. So when we think about the Gospel of Mark, one of the things that we can kind of gloss over as well is this, is the genre of Mark. So let's look at it. The genre of Mark is, in fact, the Gospel, okay, or a Gospel. But here's the interesting thing about this type of writing. Before the Gospels, and actually what we're going to see, because we're going to see something in a second, the Gospel of Mark is the first of its kind. There were no Gospels before the four Gospels that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That was the first of its kind. As a matter of fact, the Gospel of Mark was kind of written after what we see is, it's actually B-I-O-U, it's a Greek word. But what does that sound like? Like a biography, right? So the way that these Gospels are written were based on like biographies almost. So when we look at the Gospel, over time, it became a type of writing. So with Mark and Matthew and Luke and John, it was something that wasn't already established, but what are they going by? This is what we see.
They're going by, they were there.
Well, sure, no doubt. But the writing style itself of how they're writing it is this right here. It's called an evangelion. Evangelion. Okay? And that literally means the good news. Like we go back to Genesis 3, and a lot of times people say that's the first evangelion, the first, or the proto-evangelion, which means first, the first gospel, the first good news. But the thing about that is that the evangelion was not something that was just singular to Christians or singular to the writings of the Gospels. It was actually something that was that Greeks used. As a matter of fact, there were evangelions written for like the Caesars. As a matter of fact, early church person named Suetonius, or not church person, but an early historian named Suetonius, wrote a book called Lives of the Caesars. And basically it talked about the association with the birth of a king or the ascension to a throne in Rome or another king like that. So an evangelion was just that. It was a word to describe the birth of this new king, or the arrival of this king, or this new day that was being brought in.
So, but not all evangelical.
Evangelion, yeah, either way.
Evangelion.
Yes.
Are they all about the Messiah, about God?
No, well, not the ones that are secular, no. So like there would be like, for example, one for a Caesar. They would write an Evangelion about the life of another Caesar or something like that.
So it just means
yes. Yes. And the way in which Mark is writing his gospel is in that type of writing style, because that's what we see. Even with Matthew, we see the birth of Jesus. We see him coming onto the scene. We see his life being lived out. So it's in a way a biography. However, that is the way in which Mark is writing the gospel so that we can see this life. Yes, ma'am. Well, the Evangelion, the good news, would be, well, they would call it good news, because if you didn't worship Caesar, you're dead. So it would be, the people that were writing it would be writing it in a way that would show that this Caesar was this great figure and like all that kind of stuff. So that's why it would be that. But anyway, that is kind of the way we see this gospel. Again, it's not something that we see before this. It's something new. It's a new genre, right? If you want a definition of the word gospel, I didn't add it in there, but it's basically historical narratives motivated by theological concerns. So that's what a gospel is. It's a historical narrative. It's a story based on history, motivated by theological concerns. And theological are doctrines that deal with God. Basically, how do we live out compared to who God is? So again, nothing quite like it in the first century. As a matter of fact, let's look at a few of these aspects. This will help you a little bit. Theological concerns. You can get that definition afterwards if you need to. So historical narratives motivated by theological concerns. So these narratives were motivated by the theological concerns of Mark. This will help you right here. 3 aspects of gospel genre. These are the 3 aspects of what a gospel genre is. Number 1, like I just told you, is historical. A gospel genre is historical. It means that it is grounded in history. This isn't just some story that Mark is making up. This is fact. This is truth. This is history. This is like World War II is history. What the Gospel of Mark is history. As a matter of fact, even secular scholars, the best of them, will tell you the same thing. It's a historical narrative. Now, they might not believe the miracle aspects of it, but they will tell you that this is historical. Jesus was a real man. He really died on a real cross. He was crucified. Like all of these things. The whole Bible is historical, but this is one of the main facets of the gospel genre, is that it is historical. As a matter of fact, it's an eyewitness account, which takes it even further. It's not something that was seen and then written about 500 years later. I mean, it was written at a later date, but it's something that Mark himself and the actual apostles and the people that lived through these days, it were things that were seen by the people in those days, right? And we're going to see in a second where a lot of that information that Mark got his information from, but we're going to see that. Number 2, it's narrative literature. It's story. It's actually, and I'm not saying story as in like a fairy tale. It's written in narrative format. So it's not just like here's one point, here's one point, here's one point. It is chronological a lot of times. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes the Gospels are not written in chronological order. But for the most part, they are. They're written from the birth of Jesus to him going to the cross. Lastly, like I've already mentioned, Mark is theological. A gospel genre is theological. What does that mean? Well, it means this. It's not just about getting the events. It's not just about getting the history. It's not even just about getting the narrative. It's more than that. It's actually understanding that these events are God-like in nature. It's that there's a lot to take from them. It's practical. It's applicable. There's significance in these events, not just the events themselves. For example, the cross. And what do we do with that, right? And you know, it's kind of like commentators who are looking back on a race after they know who won. That's what's going on with the book of Mark. He already know who won. When he's writing his gospel, he knows that Jesus won this. So when he's writing this, it's like a commentator who's looking back on a race after he already knew who won. So there's a lot of things that is in there that is not just historical. It's theological. It's grounded in who God is and his character. So again, that's what makes it different than just some historical document. Because here's the thing, there are a lot of historical documents out there. A ton. But none of them are as life-changing and have as much theological significance like the books in the Bible do. And that's including the Gospel of Mark. All right, so here's the next thing that you need to know. It is called Markan priority. Markan, just talking about Mark, is that Mark was written first out of the Gospels, the 4 Gospels. Mark, by most scholars, was written first.
How do they know that?
No. It is very good research is how they know that. Based on the text itself, based on the historical markers that are in the text itself, and based on datings and stuff like that. It takes a minute to go through all that, but you can get it. I've done it before. You can get it, and we're going to see. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yeah, we do. We're going to be looking at it second too, for sure. So again, Mark was written first, and again, with each gospel, what we see basically is 4 different portraits of Jesus' life and ministry. This is why there's 4. I just want to mention this very quickly, because somebody might say, why do we have 4 gospels? Well, it's because there's 4 eyewitness accounts. There's 4 accounts of what Jesus did. And the beautiful part is that with all of these accounts, we have more information that we can gather that we can look at. So Matthew and Luke have about 90% of Mark's gospels. So if you flip those on the other side, the percentage goes down if you're trying to pull it from Matthew or from Luke. What does that mean? I know that was just a lot. That means that because Matthew and Luke have about 90% of Mark's gospels, well, what I'm saying is a lot of people think that Matthew and Luke and some of the other writers pull from Mark because he was the first one to write down the stories. And they actually might have even used his account to write their stories themselves, even though they had their own individual story to tell. You get that? Like, for example, you read John or you read Matthew, it's going to look different than Mark. But we can see that because Mark was written first, that there was probably some pullover from the other Gospels. And here's an issue with this from the early church days, okay? Mark was really on the back burner for a long time because of some of the things we're going to look at. And this is the reason why I love studying Mark. Because of how short Mark is, because of how rough it is, we're going to see in a second, because of how different it is from Matthew and Luke, who Luke's a doctor. He had put all this order. Oh, Theophilus, I've written this account to you so that you can know, blah, 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 right? That's Luke, right? With Mark, it's just like, bam, bam, bam. Like, it's going. Like, we're getting it, son. So, like, a lot of people in the early church looked at Mark and kind of put it on the back burner because, like, this guy, we'll go look at Matthew and Luke before we'll look at Mark. And because of that, Mark, again, was the shortest gospel. But because of that, no commentary was written on Mark until the 6th century. So for give you an example, The first commentary, major commentary we see of Matthew, I think it was by Origen of Alexandria, was in about 200 something. With Mark, it wasn't until 600s, late 600s, where we see anything like that. Where a major, that's a long time, that's 400 years later, that we see a major commentary written on the book of Mark. What does that tell us? Again, it wasn't as important to them because they were probably looking at Matthew because there's more information there, or Luke, there's more information there. But what we're going to see is that that was a grave mistake because there is a lot of amazing stuff in the book of Mark. As a matter of fact, between AD 650 and AD 1000, during that time period, there were 13 major commentaries written on Matthew, while only 4 on Mark.
Was that strictly because of the roughness of
A little bit, yep. The grammar, we're going to look at that in a second, but yeah, the grammar, different stuff like that, for sure. So again, it wasn't until about the 19th century that Markan priority became the source or the actual focal point. 19th century. That was just recently, right? And again, that became known because it became known that Mark was, in fact, the earliest written account, and then more people started studying it. It's pretty amazing when you think about that, right? So let's look at the authorship. And all of this can be Googled. Well, be careful with Google. Don't just Google stuff. All of this can be studied and known, okay? You can go research the Markan priority, how we get that. That would take a while. We can get, like I just said, like more into the gospel genres and how we determined all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I'm just trying to give you a very brief but thorough overview before we dive into the book of Mark. All right, authorship. Tradition for Markan authorship is consistent, and early church fathers affirm it as well. As a matter of fact, let me get my book out because I want to share something with you. This is actually where I'm getting a lot of our information from, people that are watching too. This is a commentary on Mark, just that. And there's like a gazillion of these commentaries like that. But I want to share something with you. Speaking about the early, get back here. The early church fathers actually said that it was Mark, even them. Let me show you this. For example, one of them was named Papias. So this is Papias writing about Mark. This is about AD 95 to 110. And he's quoting John the Elder concerning the authorship of Mark. He says this, the presbyter used to say this also. And then he quotes, Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote down accurately, but not in order. All that he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord, for he had not heard the Lord or been one of his followers, which we're going to see that. But later, as I said, a follower of Peter. Peter used to teach as the occasion demanded without giving systematic arrangement to the Lord's sayings, so that Mark did not err in writing down some things just as he recalled them. For he had one overriding purpose, to omit nothing that he had heard and to make no false statements in his account. Now that is very interesting because that's AD 95. That's just shortly after the crucifixion. I mean, that's just right there at it. So this is a follower, Papias, saying, this is what Mark did. This is how he wrote his account. And this was probably a disciple from from Mark. And then you have more stories about that too. You can go to Eusebius, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria. These are all people right after in line, these early church fathers that know that Mark was the author of this gospel. And we're going to see it in the scripture in a minute too. But what did we just see through that passage I just read you? Mark got his information from who? Peter, right? So it just told us, even Papias says it right there. He wasn't really a follower of the Lord as it relates to physically, but he got his information from one who did, which was Peter the apostle. So as Miss Janie just mentioned, What can we know about Mark? And who is Mark, right? Because that's a big question, right? Well, I think we have some very good evidence in the Bible. So what do we know about John Mark? That's who we see this person is. Flip in your Bibles real quick to Acts. We're not going over a ton of scripture today, so I got to make you flip somewhere. Go to Acts chapter 12. I think it's verse 12. Let's see. Yes. So after, and this is going to, we're going to see the connection with Peter here. This is after Peter's rescued. All right. You remember that story where he's in the prison and all that? And he gets saved miraculously by the angel that comes and everything. Look at verse 12. It says, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was what? Mark, where many were gathered together and praying. So the first thing that we see is this. John Mark, or Mark, was the son of a prominent woman in Jerusalem church where the apostles met. And this is where Mark probably got his information from Peter, because he's with him. He's living with him. He's doing life together as a disciple. But the first thing we see is that John Mark was a son of a prominent woman in Jerusalem and where the apostles met. It was actually their church there. If you flip down to verse 25, we can see that the next thing that we see is that Barnabas, look what it says, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them again John, whose other name was Mark. So there's the next instance we see of this Mark. He's introducing this character to us here. So we're going to see that Mark is going to play a role temporarily with the mission of Paul and the other apostles in taking the gospel to the nations. Okay? So John Mark accompanies Paul and Barnabas and these other ones to take this mission out to the world. But here's the thing. Here's something else we know about John Mark, is that there was a disagreement, though, with Paul and Barnabas. And in this disagreement, we're going to see something take place where, look at Acts 13, where Mark is actually told to go, all right? So in Acts 13:13, it says, now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. But they went on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia. And what's interesting about this is that later we're going to see that because of that right there, Paul looks at Mark differently because he thinks that he deserted them. And maybe he did. He deserted them. So Mark deserts the mission. He deserts and goes back to Jerusalem. And his name is kind of stained for a little bit. However, we're going to see that a reconciliation takes place between John and Mark, because eventually in 2 Timothy, flip to 2 Timothy chapter 4, look at what it says. At some point they must have reconciled, because it says, Luke, this is Paul speaking, Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for the ministry. So again, we see apparently this reconciliation takes place at some time. And then you don't have to flip there, but we also know in Colossians 4:10 that John Mark is Barnabas' cousin. He's the cousin of Barnabas, who is another one that went on the missions with Paul throughout those nations. So he's cousins with Barnabas. Yes. So we see that John Mark is a pretty prevalent person. We see that he's not just the Gospel of Mark author. We see that he was involved in the ministry. He was involved in mission work with Paul. We see that apparently there was some discord between them and apparently some reconciliation that happens much later. But we know that he was very prevalent in the ministry. Okay? So he wasn't just some person that Peter told this story to and then wrote it down. He was an actual, he was a Christian. He was somebody who was following the life and teachings of Jesus. And apparently Peter thought well enough to instill these words to him. And then lastly, we see this. Look at 1 Peter. This is Peter writing this letter. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. We haven't got there yet, but we're going to in our Sunday sermon series. He writes his final greetings, and look at what Peter says. He says, verse 13, she who is at Babylon, that's why we're going to see that's another word for Rome, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does who? My son. Greet one another with a kiss of love. So apparently, Mark was like a son to Peter. And of course, if you're the son, he's probably the one that he's telling it all to, right? So again, we see these little connections with Peter and Mark. And like I said already, we know that Mark got his information from Peter because the early church also attests to that as well. So, and again, I want to reiterate this, or not reiterate, but I want to tell you this. There are no competing claims in the early church that the authorship was anyone other than Mark, John Mark. There are no competing claims from the early church that somebody else wrote the Gospel of Mark other than John Mark. So that's pretty helpful too, to know that there's no other claims going, oh no, this guy wrote it or this guy wrote it. No, the authorship was, of course, none other than Mark himself. All right, so speaking of authorship, let's look at the dating. The dating of Mark is, and it's kind of a wide date, which is fine, 40s to the 70s AD. So 40 to 70 AD. But as this commentary does and many other commentaries, I think personally, and you can argue this, but I think personally it's likely that it was the mid-60s to late 60s. And you might be thinking, well, Colby, why do you say that? Well, there's a lot of things why I would say that. Number one, it's the persecution that's taking place in Rome in Mark. And it's the abomination of desolation, which we'll talk about. It's the destruction of the temple, which happens in AD 70. It's a lot of these persecutions that we see that are tied to that time period. Now, again, I'm not getting into that today. We could talk about that, another day. But that's the dating, 40 to 70, and some go early. There's scholars that go early and go into the 40s or the 50s, right? But if you're looking at the traditional scholarship or the consensus scholarship of today, a lot of people say Mark 60s, Matthew 70s to 90s, Luke 80s to 90s, and John 90s to 110 AD. Okay? Now, I know that's a lot of times being thrown at you, but again, you can see that the Markan priority shows that it's first. And if you go back and say, oh, we're going to push it back to the 40s, okay. A lot of those other books get pushed back as well. So again, you see that Markan priority there. Yes. I mean, it's Matthew 70 to 90, Luke 80 to 90, and this is just generally, and then John 90 to 110. And again, there's scholars that debate that, but that's kind of the general consensus. So what else do we know? I just mentioned it to you. In the dating of Mark, in Mark 13, we see that there's intense persecution going on at this time. Intense persecution. So if it's written in the mid-60s to late 60s, if you look at Mark 13, flip there real quick. We see this Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple that happens in AD 70, as well as other future end time events that are going to take place much later in the future, even past us. But he says, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And again, there's disagreements there about when is that end? Is he talking about the end of time, or is he talking about when the abomination of desolation happens in the temple in AD 70? I say both, but that's just me. And then 14, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That gets into end time stuff. But what we do know is that there is persecution taking place at this time of Mark's writing. And that kind of helps us see, it kind of gives us an idea of this date. If you guys remember last week, I preached on 1 Peter 4 through the passage of suffering. And I mentioned like Caesar Nero and the sufferings that were happening. If that's the case, then this would have been about the same time. Okay? So this would have been written about the same time as all of that was taking place, which was right before the abomination of desolation, which was the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Okay, I'm ready to get to these themes because that's really the main stuff. But I mean, this is all important too. Let's look at the structure. So what's the structure of Mark? Well, the first thing is where. Where was it written? Well, it was written in Rome to Rome. In Rome to Rome. Again, in the context of persecution. So it was written to the Roman believers and the ones who were Jewish, and that's what we're going to see here. The audience was primarily Gentiles and Jewish believers. So people who had just came to the faith that were the Gentiles that weren't true Jews. Also, it was written to Jewish believers. And we can see that from looking at the context of the book of Mark, which we'll see when we go through it. Because in some places, he's writing and it's Gentile believers. In some places, it's Jewish believers. But anyway, we'll see that when we go through it. So as we kind of get through the structure, the dating, and the authorship and all of that, one of the things that I'll mention as it relates to the audience that he's writing to is that we see things like Aramaic expressions. We see Latin. We see customs of Pharisees. We see a lot of different culture of the Greek, like we've already talked about. And that's another reason why we can kind of point to and go, okay, his audience was not just the Jewish believers, it was Gentile believers as well, because again, he's using things that are outside the norms of just one particular sect of people. So it's really just all believers, if you want to, just bring it to that. All right, let's go to these themes. So the first themes that we see are timeline themes that we're going to talk about. And what do I mean by timeline? Well, it's when we read the book of Mark, there's really two main sections of the book of Mark, okay? Some people divide it differently, but this is how we're going to divide it, all right? There's really two main sections. The first section we see is where Mark is trying to present the case for Jesus as the Messiah. So from chapter 1, verse 1, to chapter 8, verse 26, we're going to see that Mark is trying to show who this Messiah is, okay? For example, in Mark chapter 2, who alone can forgive sins but God alone? But what does he do? Paralyzed man on the roof comes down and Jesus heals him. Okay, how does this happen? Or how about the fact in that same story, it says Jesus knowing their thoughts. Okay, and then we keep going on. How about he's walking on water? How about he's feeding the 5,000? How about he's doing all these different things that are tying back to who the true Messiah is? And again, we're going to get into all of that, which I think is just amazing for us when we go through those. So the first 8 chapters is that section. But then in 8:27, I want you to flip. Go to Mark 8, verse 27. Because in Mark 8:27, we get the climax of Mark. This is the middle point. This is the central point of the book of Mark. And he says this, and Jesus, went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples what? Who do people say that I am? So the first 8 chapters of Mark, he's outlining this character of Jesus the Messiah. He's trying to show you through these stories and this narrative of who Jesus truly is. As a matter of fact, in verse 1 of Mark, we see that he's the Son of God. And then at the end of Mark, what we're going to see is the centurion going, surely this man was the Son of God. So the question right in the middle of Mark is just, and it's literally in the middle, pretty much. The question that we see is, who do people say that I am? And then in 28, and they told him, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And then Peter answered him, saying, you are the Christ. That's the climax that we're going to see in the book of Mark. So what about the next section? What do we see? What comes after that? Because that is where the narrative truly takes a turn. Because after 8:27, we see this climax here. It takes a turn because now, because of his profession that Jesus is the true Christ, we're going to see that he would be rejected. He would die by crucifixion, and he would raise 3 days later. So now we see that he's the suffering servant. The next section of Mark, the last from that verse 8:27 and 28 and on, we're going to see that Mark is trying to communicate that this Messiah isn't this kingly Messiah like you thought. Now, he's the king and he's the Messiah, but he's the suffering servant that came to save us from our sins. And that's what he's going to try to communicate to his people through the rest of the book, is that he is the Messiah, but he's also the suffering one. His role is not to conquer the Romans. His role is to suffer and die for the sins of the world. So, Jesus, on his path to glory, which is through the cross, he's communicating that it must come through suffering. So this next section leads us into the theological themes. So our timeline themes are the Messiah and the suffering servant. The theological themes that we see through the book are this. Number one is that Mark is presenting a big case of Christology. And what does that mean? We'll look up in the parentheses there. It means the study of the work and life of Christ. So there is high Christology in Mark, high study of the work and life of Christ, just like a lot of the other Gospels. However, a couple of things that are interesting in the book of Mark are this. When looking at this Christology, which literally means the study of Christ, just like theology is theos, which is God, study of God things, the study of Christ, what we see in the book of Mark is we get the most human portrait of Jesus in the Gospels. That's one thing that Mark gives us. It's a very vivid imagery. He gives us a lot of things like when he's in the boat and he's sleepy and he's tired, like all these, or he's hungry. Mark gives us the most vast depiction of Jesus as a human. Okay? Not to say that Matthew and them don't, but he does it to the extent of it. All right? We see that has indignation, like we're going to see when Jesus comes to the temple and he cleanses the temple and he's mad. He's angry. We're going to see grief when he's looking out on the sheep without a shepherd. We're going to see anger, like I just mentioned to you. We're going to see amazement when he sees the faith of some of these people that come up and he says, man, he was marveled at their faith, or he was amazed at their faith. We're going to see love pour out from Jesus. I mean, all these different, we can go on and on. Hunger, I mean, like I just mentioned, sleepy, like all of it. But we get this most human portrait of who Jesus is. The next thing that we see as it relates to this high Christology or this study of Christ that Mark gives us is a powerful presentation of the divinity of Christ. And I'm talking powerful, okay? From chapters 1 on, we're going to see that this man isn't just a human. He's not just man. Even though we have the most human portrait of Jesus, we can also argue that Mark gives us almost the most divine portrait of Jesus as well. For example, Jesus knows the thoughts of others, like I just mentioned. He forgives sin. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. He calms the storm. He walks on water. We can go on and on about all these different things that Mark shows us to go, hey, listen, this ain't just some guy. As a matter of fact, he's God in the flesh with us. And Mark is trying to tell us that. And that is the path that Mark lays out from the beginning of his gospel all the way through. Who's this guy? Even the disciples. Who is this guy? How is he doing all this? Did you see that he just controlled the waves and the water? Like, I mean, even they asked that. They're in the story. Who is this man? Like, that can control the waves and the seas and all that. And constantly we see that question, who is this? We go through these different, he's healing these different people. Who is this man? Who is this? And then, of course, we get the climax. And then from then on out, he's like, this is who he is, right? And then finally it closes with that centurion saying that. So we see that high Christology. But here's the second important thing that we see as it relates to the theological themes is this: cross-bearing discipleship. Cross-bearing discipleship. Mark doesn't just want us to know who Jesus is. Mark in his gospel is trying to communicate what it truly takes to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And that starts when we see that road to the cross, that suffering that Jesus goes through. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting things about the disciples in the book of Mark, and if you don't believe me, wait till we get there. The disciples in the book of Mark are actually depicted as anti-disciples. They're not pictured as these amazing, righteous people that are following Jesus. Trust me, wait and see. We'll go through it. They're really depicted as anti-disciples. Every time he predicts his death, they have pride, self-interest. They always go against him, like Peter denying it. Like, we're going to see that they're actually depicted as people who we don't need to follow. Like when they desert Jesus at the cross, like all these different things. Whereas we think of the disciples and we're going, oh man, these were great people that followed Jesus and man, they were just perfect and righteous and all this kind of. No, Mark is going, no, these are people you don't want to be like. You know who you need to focus on? You know what? There you go. He is trying to point everybody to Jesus and the suffering that he goes through and the alone and how he was by himself and all these things. And our eyes are just going, man, how does this guy go through all of this for me? Everybody deserts him. Everybody goes their own way. But Jesus Christ does this for me. And he wants us to know that. As a matter of fact, every time, like I just mentioned, he predicts his death, the disciples follow with some act of pride. And we're going to look at that when we go through too. Every time, by the way, you can go look at it. But here's the other thing. Mark wants his readers to know that all who aspire to be Jesus' disciples must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. I think I changed a little bit on your sheet there. But basically, all who aspire to be Jesus' disciples must deny themselves. As a matter of fact, we're there at Mark 8 right now. Look at verse 34. Look at what he says. This is right after the climax. Notice it. These are little things to think about. Right after he says, you are the Christ. Well, he says, okay, Peter, you're telling me that I'm the Christ? Well, let me tell you something. Because if you want to follow me, I'm going to show you. Look at what 34 says. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, notice that the crowd as well. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would lose it or save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And that's right after the climax of who Jesus really is. And he's saying, yeah, I'm telling you who I am, but let me tell you something. Unless you do that right there, you can't follow me. And that's the second theme that we see is this idea of cross-bearing discipleship. He wants us to know what it means to truly be a disciple of Christ. It's not the disciples who flee from Jesus after he goes to the cross. or he's on his way to the cross and they leave him stranded by himself, or the Garden of Gethsemane when he goes to him multiple times. Can you not just stay away from them one more hour? And they're sleeping and tired. I'm telling you, it's so scattered through this book of the gospel. You're going to be going away from this class going, wow.
Yeah. When you started, you talked about a lot of the other Mark's book was first, and a lot of these other authors, like Luke, this very same verse, almost word for word.
Right.
In Luke 9:23.
Exactly, 100%. Yeah, and you'll see that with the synoptic gospels, with the gospels that have these same things in them as well, no doubt. So as we finish, I want to look at a few distinctives, okay? And what I mean by that, these are things that set Mark apart, okay? That we see that are just with Mark and not the other disciples, or excuse me, the Gospels. Not that some of them don't have some of these things, but Mark is just very known for these things. Number one is this that you'll see, is you already know this, it's fast-paced. As a matter of fact, the word immediately, translated immediately, happens 41 times in the book of Mark. That's a lot of times in one gospel. So what is Mark? He's wanting you to get this. Like, it's a fast-paced gospel. You can read it pretty quickly, actually. I think it's, it's not many chapters. So like you can read 16 chapters if you use the longer ending and all that. Yeah, and it's going, right? So it's fast-paced. The next thing that we see is Mark's, it is the roughest gospel. When we look at the syntax and we look at the Greek, it's very awkward in its Greek structure. What we think is that he likely spoke Aramaic. That's one of the reasons he uses Aramaic phrases. And Greek was probably his second language. So that's one of the reasons why it's a little rough. Whereas someone like Luke, who's the doctor, was probably a lot more schooled. The Greek structure was a lot better. And we know that Mark was written in Greek. Again, Mark uses Aramaic phrases such as Talitha Kum, which is the story where the little girl arise because she had died. Remember the 12-year-old girl? Or Korban, which was a gift or sacrifice to God. He uses that. Or Ephatha, which means be opened, when he spits on the ground and opens the guy's eyes and ears. Remember all that? So like we can see through some of these phrases that he probably spoke Aramaic as well. So Mark is the roughest gospel out of all of them. The next thing we see, which I love, this is really cool, is something called Markan sandwiches. Markan sandwiches. Or in other words, an intercalation. And you might be going, what in the world are you talking about, Colby? Like, what is a Markan sandwich? Well, let me give you an example. In chapter 11 of Mark, do you remember when he goes up to the fig tree and there's nothing on the fig tree, and what does he do?
He gets mad at it, curses it.
And then right after that, do you know where he goes? To cleanse the temple. He goes into the temple, and guess where there ain't no fruit? No spiritual fruit. In the temple. And he's cleansing them out. And then you know what he does right after that? He goes back to the tree and he says, there's no fruit here. Go read it. Chapter 11. And it's a sandwich. He's sandwiching two stories together. That's really what's happening. And in the middle of it is the temple, which is the main focal point, is what he's trying to show us. Right? So he's trying to give us these sandwiches to communicate a point. Here's another one. You want another one? There's actually many of them. I only put two of them down. But there's another one. How about Jairus' daughter? I don't know why my computer thing just wigged out. Good thing we're close to the end there. But another one that we see is Jairus' daughter. Do you remember when the woman with the blood disease comes? Or excuse me, I think it's actually, I'm trying to think of the order now. But remember, the story is kind of weird because you got Jairus' daughter who's passed away, and then we get this woman with the blood disease that had been in this blood disease for 12 years. How old was Jairus' daughter? 12. Like all these similarities. And there's this sandwich that takes place where it shows that Jesus, the point is that Jesus isn't just a healer of physical infirmities, he's also the healer of spiritual infirmities. He's the healer of all, right? So it's like we see this, these sandwiches that are grouped together that Mark is trying to give us to explain a certain point. And this is one of the styles of writing that he uses that the common eye wouldn't see. The average person reading through these stories wouldn't look at that and go, oh, he's sandwiching. It's actually called an intercalation. He's putting these things together to prove a point. And we're going to go through those when we go through this book, and I can't wait to do that with you. So the next thing that we see, I'm sorry it's not on here. It's just not connecting now. I don't know if we've lost internet. Maybe that's what it is. But the next thing that we see here, let me just go back here, is triads. Triads. We're about to finish anyway. And that means in groups of 3, right? And it is all over. There are 3 passion predictions. There's 3 boat scenes. There's 3 times the disciples fall asleep in the garden. There's 3 times Peter denies Christ. The crucifixion scene itself is divided into 3 3-hour segments, and on and on. We see.
Just the writing style that Mark used.
Well, no, a lot of it is truly 3 things happening, but to me, it's inspired by the Holy Spirit to, show us things, right? But we see a lot of triads in there, and maybe he's trying to use those triads to make us think about the resurrection. Maybe, stuff like that. That's just some things that I think about. All right. The last thing on your paper there to finish out with Mark's distinctives is inclusio of Son of God. And I'll spell it for you. INCLUSIO. It's a big word, but it almost means bookends. Kind of like the Markan sandwiches or sandwich in a story. The book of Mark is a sandwich itself, and it's centered around the point that Jesus is the Son of God. So he uses inclusio in this story.
Me and Mark, me and Nelson.
There you go. Sure. Why not?
We like sandwiches.
Right. And like I just told you, Mark 1:1, it tells us who is this Jesus? He's the Son of God. And at the end of Mark 15, we see the centurion saying, surely this truly is the Son of God. So he bookends his book with this inclusio, which is the Son of God, which goes back to the climax, which was who am I? Who do the people say that I am? So let me tell you something. From all of this, and I could go way deeper than this. From all of this, Mark's gospel is not just thrown together. And that's what you'll learn when we go through this book. It's not like Matthew and Luke are the neat ones, and they've got it all together.
Sound like they copy.
And Mark is like, he's the rough one, don't really go to Mark, just go start in Matthew, whatever. Mark is very constructive, and he's very diligent in how he puts his gospel together, and we're going to see that as we continue. So I'm glad that you guys got to do that introduction with me. I'm ready to start next week, so go ahead. You can read ahead if you want to. You know where I'm going to be, Mark 1, and we're going to dive in and see what we get to. So again, thank you guys for coming. Very excited to go through this book, and hopefully this helps you have a beginning place of an overview of what to expect through this book. God, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for this time. Thank you for the people here. I pray that every single one of us are just so enthusiastic about growing in this knowledge, not just for head knowledge, but so that we grow to understand your word more clearly, we can practically apply it better, and we can just love you more in our daily relationships. So God, thank you for Mark. Thank you for this book, and let everything we do be to the honor and glory of your name. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.